Lavish birthday party for my son. My name is Monica, a 34-year-old financial analyst who has spent years calculating market risks, although nothing could have prepared me for the danger hidden within these expensive walls. The sheer opulence of this celebration reminded me of my father's final will, because he chose to leave his entire trust fund to my son instead of his eldest daughter, who had always expected to inherit the family fortune. I watched my sister maintain a perfect smile while her cold eyes tracked my boy's every move, as if she were appraising an expensive piece of property rather than her own nephew. When she abruptly stepped onto the balcony to answer a lengthy phone call, I found myself searching for my son among hundreds of guests who seemed far more interested in expensive champagne than the child they were supposedly celebrating. A trembling elderly man suddenly approached me to press a folded piece of paper into my palm before leaning close to whisper a warning that shattered the festive atmosphere. "Get your son out of here now." I stood frozen while watching him disappear into the crowd, since a sudden surge of terror began racing through my veins, because a mother's instinct never ignores a warning that carries the weight of life or death. Before we proceed further, I want to express my sincere gratitude for your presence here today, because your support truly means everything to me. Please drop a comment to let me know where you are watching from, or what the weather is like in your part of the world. I love discovering how far these stories travel across the globe, while knowing that you are listening. Deciding to trust my instincts rather than conventional social politeness, I gripped Adrian's hand firmly and began moving toward the parking lot without looking back at the festive lights of the villa. I maintained the most composed expression possible while navigating through the long marble corridors where tuxedoed stewards were still circulating with trays of vintage champagne and gourmet appetizers. Although several staff members attempted to catch my eye or offer assistance, I deliberately ignored their inquiries and focused entirely on the rhythmic sound of our footsteps echoing against the polished stone floors. My heart was hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, because that folded note felt like a lead weight inside my pocket, though I knew I had to appear perfectly normal until we reached the safety of my vehicle. Adrian looked up at me with a mixture of confusion and fatigue, since he was still clutching a small party favor that he had been gifted just minutes earlier. I offered him a tight, reassuring smile, while gently urging him to quicken his pace, because the oppressive atmosphere of the house seemed to be closing in on us with every passing second. Just as we reached the heavy iron gates leading to the parking area, my brother-in-law, Clifford, stepped out from the deep shadows of the hedges while wearing a smile that felt disturbingly artificial. The dim amber lighting of the driveway cast long, jagged shadows across his face, which made his presence feel more like an interrogation than a chance encounter. He stood directly in our path with his hands tucked into his pockets as he blocked the only exit available to us. "The festivities have only just begun, Monica, so I must ask why you are behaving with such uncharacteristic haste and ignoring your basic social graces." His voice carried a smooth, calculated quality that I had always found unsettling during our previous family gatherings, because he spoke as if every word had been rehearsed for maximum effect. I could feel my fingers tightening around Adrian's hand as I forced myself to maintain a professional mask, despite the cold dread that was beginning to settle in the pit of my stomach. Clifford took a deliberate step forward and attempted to place a heavy hand on Adrian's shoulder, while leaning down to look at the boy with a predatory kind of intensity. "The celebration is far from over, Monica, so why are you in such a desperate rush that you would consider abandoning such a glorious event and losing your sense of politeness toward your hosts?" I immediately brushed his hand away from my son's shoulder with a firm motion that caused Clifford to blink in genuine surprise, because I had never openly challenged him in such a direct manner before tonight. I stood my ground while looking him directly in the eyes and adopted the same cold, analytical tone that I usually reserved for high-stakes corporate audits. Adrian is currently showing the early signs of a severe allergic reaction to something he ate during the dinner service, so we are heading to the emergency room immediately before his breathing becomes compromised. The lie came out of my mouth with surprising conviction, since I knew that the urgency of a medical emergency was the only excuse that could override the social obligations Roxanne had created. Clifford's eyes narrowed as he scanned Adrian's face for any visible symptoms of distress, though he ultimately realized that he could not justify detaining a mother who claimed her child was in medical danger. If that is truly the case, then you should certainly go, although Roxanne will be deeply disappointed that her special guest had to leave her villa under such unfortunate circumstances. I did not wait for him to finish his sentence or offer any further fake sympathies before I guided Adrian toward my car and unlocked the doors with a quick press of the key fob. Even as I climbed into the driver's seat and buckled my son into his safety harness, I could feel a piercing stare emanating from the second-floor balcony that overlooked the driveway. I glanced upward and saw Roxanne standing perfectly still against the light of the house while her silhouette cast a long, dark shadow that seemed to stretch across the asphalt toward my vehicle. Her gaze was sharp and unforgiving, like a hawk watching a small animal attempt a desperate escape into the undergrowth. There was no warmth or concern in her posture, because she looked like a woman who had just seen a carefully constructed plan begin to unravel before her very eyes. I started the engine, and the roar of the car felt like a lifeline that was finally pulling us away from the suffocating luxury of the estate. I pressed the accelerator and guided the vehicle through the gates while the tires chirped against the wet pavement of the Portland streets. As we merged into the main road, the thick blanket of gray fog that frequently rolled through the city began to envelop the car and obscured the villa in the rearview mirror. I found myself glancing at that mirror every few seconds to see if any headlights were tailing us through the darkness, though the road behind us remained empty and silent. My hands were still shaking as I gripped the steering wheel, because I realized that we were no longer just guests at a party, but fugitives from a life I no longer recognized. We drove deeper into the misty night, while Adrian eventually drifted into a restless sleep beside me. I knew that the safety of our own home was still several miles away, and the real battle for our survival was only just beginning. Only 30 minutes after my front door was secured with 3 separate locks, I finally dared to let go of Adrian's hand and began facing the truth. I moved through the silence of my home while ensuring every window was firmly latched before I finally managed to settle my son into his bed for the night. I whispered several soft reassurances to the sleeping boy, although my own heart was still hammering against my ribs with a violence that made it difficult to breathe. Once his breathing became steady and deep, I retreated to my small home office, where the blue light of the computer monitor felt strangely cold and unwelcoming in the darkness. I immediately picked up my phone to call my best friend Sonia, a cybersecurity expert who had helped me manage my digital security since my husband passed away several years ago. Sonia answered almost instantly with a voice that was thick with concern, because she knew I would never reach out at such an hour without a desperate reason. "Monica, why do you need to check the trust fund account at this hour? Is something happening with Roxanne and Clifford that has made you this anxious?" Her question hung in the air while I provided my encrypted credentials to begin a deep audit of the estate my father had left specifically for my son. I explained the strange events at the villa and the warning note from the elderly man while Sonia began typing rapidly to bypass the standard authentication layers of the bank. The silence on the other end of the line grew heavy as we waited for the encrypted files to load onto my private server for a full financial investigation. We quickly discovered a pending transaction of $60,000 that was scheduled to be pulled from the primary account at the start of the next business week. My vision blurred momentarily when I saw that the authorization carried my unique digital signature, which suggested a sophisticated level of forgery that only a professional could execute. I stared at the glowing screen while my fingers gripped the edge of the mahogany desk because I realized Clifford had exploited his administrative privileges at the investment firm. He had managed to create a secret backdoor into my father's estate records to alter the security preferences without triggering any of the standard email notifications I usually received. It became clear that he had been monitoring my digital activity for months while waiting for the perfect moment to strike during the chaos of the birthday celebration. Sonia's typing suddenly stopped, and she let out a sharp gasp that sounded like a physical blow through the small speaker of my smartphone. Oh my God. Monica, they have successfully added Roxanne to the emergency guardian list, which gives her full control of the assets if Adrian has an accident. My blood felt like ice water in my veins as I processed the terrifying implications of that specific legal change to my son's inheritance. I realized that the lavish birthday party was simply a calculated performance designed to lure us into a false sense of security while they prepared their final move. Roxanne was never interested in celebrating her nephew's 7th birthday because she was merely conducting a cold appraisal of the wealth she intended to steal for herself. Every smile she offered and every gift she presented was a distraction to keep me from noticing the systematic dismantling of the financial protection my father had built. The opulence of the villa now seemed like a gilded cage where they had hoped to trap us until the legal paperwork was finalized without my knowledge. I sat in the darkness of my office while the realization that my own sister was plotting against my child's life began to consume my thoughts entirely. This was no longer just a dispute over a will, because it had evolved into a lethal game of shadows where the prize was my son's future. Sonia promised to keep a digital watch on the accounts while advising me to stay away from the villa until we could gather enough evidence to bring them down. I thanked her and hung up the phone, although I knew that sleep would be impossible while such a monstrous betrayal was unfolding in real time. I looked at the printed documents on my desk and realized that these numbers were the only map I had to navigate through the darkness Roxanne had created. The $60,000 was just the beginning of their greed, and I had to find a way to stop them before the scheduled accident became a reality. 1 hour had passed since the glowing digits on the computer screen began exposing the magnitude of the betrayal when my private phone suddenly vibrated with an unrecognized number across the dark surface of my desk. I hesitated for several long seconds before answering because the heavy silence of my home felt incredibly fragile after our frantic escape from the villa, though the urgency of the situation finally forced me to press the receiver to my ear. The caller was Eugene, an elderly man who had served as a loyal estate manager for my father for over 30 years before being unceremoniously pushed aside by my sister's aggressive management style. His voice sounded thin and raspy like dry leaves blowing across cold pavement, since he was clearly speaking from a place of deep-seated fear for his own safety. He immediately bypassed any formal greetings to reveal that Roxanne was currently buried under a mountain of crushing debt following several failed luxury real estate developments throughout the Portland waterfront area. Eugene explained that her lavish lifestyle had been funded by high-interest loans from dangerous creditors who were now growing increasingly violent in their demands for immediate repayment. Roxanne doesn't just want the money, Monica, because she truly believes our late father's assets should have belonged to her instead of a 7-year-old child. This statement sent a fresh wave of nausea through my entire body because it confirmed that my sister viewed Adrian as a mere financial obstacle to her own survival, rather than a beloved member of her family. Eugene continued by detailing a mysterious accident that had occurred exactly 2 years ago involving a distant cousin who had stood between Clifford and a significant amount of inheritance money. This relative had supposedly fallen from a jagged cliffside during a private weekend retreat at the Oregon coast, although the police investigation had been quietly closed after Clifford exerted his professional influence over the local authorities. I felt my blood turning to ice as I connected these scattered pieces of information and realized that Roxanne was currently finalizing her most cruel and calculated plan to date. It was no longer just about the $60,000 or the fraudulent guardian paperwork, because they were systematically clearing every hurdle for a permanent solution to their impending financial ruin. The transition of my son into his aunt's legal custody was merely the preliminary step in a larger sequence of events that would eventually lead to another tragic accident without any witnesses. I tightened my grip on the smartphone until my knuckles turned white, while my breathing became shallow and erratic in the dimly lit office where the nursery monitor hummed softly beside me. Eugene sensed my growing panic and lowered his voice to a whisper that carried the terrifying weight of a deathbed confession. If you want the evidence that will actually put them behind bars, Sterling is the only person who still possesses the courage to speak the truth. He provided me with a specific address in a neglected industrial district of the city, where a man named Sterling was supposedly hiding from the very people who had destroyed his physical health and his livelihood. Sterling had once been a promising construction foreman before a suspicious industrial mishap left him permanently disabled and destitute, while Clifford walked away with a massive insurance settlement that was never shared with the victim. I grabbed a leather-bound notebook and began feverishly writing down every detail that Eugene provided, since I knew that these names and dates were the only weapons I had left in this war. The realization that my own sister was capable of such monstrous behavior acted as a powerful catalyst that transformed my paralyzing fear into a sharp and focused resolve to fight back. I realized that to protect Adrian from the predators circling our lives, I would have to stop being the fearful prey and start becoming a hunter who was willing to strike first. Every detail Eugene shared about Clifford's manipulation of the legal system reinforced to ensure they could never walk free again. I looked at the sleeping face of my son on the small screen and vowed that no amount of debt or greed would ever touch him while I was still drawing breath in this world. The era of my passive compliance was officially over because I finally understood that the people I called family were the very ones who were planning to bury us both in unmarked graves. I closed the notebook and felt a cold clarity settle over me as I prepared to step out into the rain and face the ghosts of my sister's past. Exactly 8 o'clock the following morning, as the feeble Oregon sunlight began to pierce through the thick morning mist, I steered my car toward a dilapidated apartment complex on the outskirts of the city to find Sterling. My hands were still trembling against the steering wheel while I navigated through the narrow, pothole-ridden streets, because the weight of the evidence I had discovered the previous night was almost too much for me to bear alone. Sterling was a former construction foreman who had once been a vibrant and strong man before a suspicious industrial mishap stripped him of his livelihood and his physical health. He greeted me while sitting in a creaky, aging wheelchair that seemed just as weary as the man himself, since his eyes were immediately filled with a profound gloom the moment I mentioned the names Roxanne and Clifford. The interior of his small apartment smelled of stale coffee and old newspapers, which created an atmosphere of stagnant despair that made my heart ache for the life he had lost. Sterling remained silent for a long moment before he slowly pulled up his pant legs to reveal the twisted and withered limbs that were the permanent legacy of his supposed accident. "They took my legs, Monica, and they heartlessly exchanged my entire future for a single insurance check worth $500,000. His voice was heavy with a bitterness that chilled me to the bone, since he spoke as if he were recounting a sentence of life imprisonment rather than a mere tragedy. He described in agonizing detail how Clifford had meticulously staged a fall down a steep flight of concrete stairs during a late-night site inspection while ensuring there were no witnesses present to contradict his version of the events. Clifford had then utilized his professional influence to gain unauthorized access to the intensive care unit, while Sterling was still drifting in a drug-induced coma, to force a thumbprint signature on documents that waived all of his legal rights to further compensation. According to Sterling's haunting account, Roxanne had stood in the corner of that sterile hospital room while watching him struggle for breath without a single flicker of compassion appearing in her cold eyes. She was apparently only interested in the specific timeline of the bank transfers because her own financial survival depended entirely on how quickly she could liquidate the assets stolen from his suffering. It was terrifying to realize that my sister had sat by my side at family dinners for years, while harboring the knowledge that she had effectively destroyed a man's life for the sake of a luxury lifestyle she could no longer afford. Sterling's hands tightened around the armrests of his wheelchair, while he recalled the casual way Roxanne had discussed his permanent disability, as if it were nothing more than a minor line item in a business ledger. I felt a surge of physical nausea while listening to the cold-blooded nature of their operation, but I reached into my leather bag to pull out a recent photograph of my son, whose innocent smile seemed impossibly bright in such a dark and desolate room. "Please, Sterling, I am begging you to help me because they are now targeting my innocent son, who has done nothing to deserve the cruel fate they have planned for him." I watched his expression shift from hollow despair to a sudden sharp focus as he looked at the face of the 7-year-old boy who was currently standing in the center of a lethal web of greed. Sterling stared at the photograph for a long minute while his jaw tightened with a renewed sense of purpose that I had not expected to find in a man who had been so thoroughly broken. He eventually reached into a small hidden compartment within the worn lining of his wheelchair to produce a silver digital voice recorder that had remained concealed for over 2 years as his only form of protection. I managed to record their private conversation while they thought I was still unconscious, because I knew a day would come when their arrogance would finally lead to their downfall. He handed me the small device which he described as his final insurance policy against the monsters who had stolen his ability to walk and his dignity in one fell swoop. The recording supposedly contained clear evidence of Clifford and Roxanne discussing the distribution of the insurance payout while they were standing right next to his hospital bed. I gripped the recorder as if it were a holy relic, since I knew that this single piece of digital evidence could be the key to destroying the empire of lies my sister had built. Sterling looked me directly in the eyes while his voice regained a measure of the strength it must have possessed before the accident ruined him. "Take it, Monica, and make sure that those predators never have the chance to destroy another family for the sake of their own hollow greed." Exactly 12 o'clock noon, taking advantage of the moment while Roxanne and Clifford were occupied at a high-stakes real estate auction downtown, I used an old spare key to quietly slip into their secluded home office. The air inside the room felt unnaturally cold and sterile, as if the very walls were aware of the dark secrets contained within the various locked cabinets and drawers. I began searching through the bottom compartment of Clifford's heavy oak desk until I discovered a thick navy blue folder that bore a disgustingly clinical label titled "Adrian's Exit Strategy." My hands began to tremble as I opened the cover because the documents inside were not mere financial records, but a comprehensive blueprint for the destruction of my son's life. Inside this folder lay a meticulously crafted schedule for a private sailing excursion on the Columbia River during the upcoming weekend, where the cellular service was non-existent and the water was notoriously deep. The map was marked with specific coordinates that highlighted a treacherous section of the river where the currents were strong enough to sweep away even the most experienced swimmer. I felt a surge of physical nausea while reading through the handwritten notes that Roxanne had scribbled along the margins of the itinerary. Her elegant cursive script detailed the process of hiring a professional diver to be stationed underwater at a precise location to ensure that Adrian's planned fall into the river resulted in an inevitable drowning. She had even noted the exact amount of time it would take for the rescue services to arrive, and calculated that 45 minutes would be more than enough to ensure the tragedy was finalized. It was chilling to see my own sister's handwriting discussing the murder of her nephew with the same detached professionalism she used for her multi-million-dollar property developments. I immediately realized that Roxanne was the true mastermind behind the physical execution of the plan, while Clifford focused his efforts on the logistical and legal cover-up that would follow. Clifford had already prepared several sets of fraudulent autopsy reports that were left blank, except for the anticipated cause of death being listed as accidental asphyxiation due to immersion. Beside these horrifying documents was a comprehensive list of local investigators and county officials who had been systematically bribed using the $60,000 that Sonia and I had tracked earlier. These were the names of the people who were supposed to protect the citizens of Portland, but had instead sold their integrity to facilitate the greed of a collapsing real estate empire. I whispered into my phone to communicate with Sonia, who was monitoring my location through a secure digital link. Sonia, I have managed to capture clear photographs of every page, and the details of their nautical plan are absolutely sickening. She responded with an urgent tone that matched the gravity of the evidence I was currently holding in my shaking hands. Please remain calm, Monica. Just get out of there before they return, because we cannot afford for you to be caught now. I was in the middle of photographing the final page of the bribery list when the distinctive rumble of Clifford's luxury sedan echoed through the paved driveway of the estate. My heart skipped a frantic beat and my breath hitched in my throat because I knew I only had seconds to restore the office to its original state. I moved with a speed born of pure desperation, while ensuring that every folder was returned to its exact position inside the bottom drawer to avoid leaving any traces of my intrusion. I managed to slip out through the service entrance and vanish into the dense foliage of the backyard, just as the front door of the main house opened with a heavy thud. I remained hidden behind a row of tall cedar trees while I watched Clifford walk toward the office window, with a relaxed stride that suggested he had no idea his secrets were now in my possession. I have everything we need, Sonia, and I am leaving through the back gate to reach my car right now, I whispered, as I began the long walk back toward the secondary road where I had hidden my vehicle. My fingers were still trembling violently when I reached the safety of the driver's seat and locked the doors against the world that had suddenly become so dangerous. The profound sense of hatred I felt for Roxanne and Clifford began to eclipse the fear because I could not comprehend how people sharing the same blood could plan something so monstrously cold-blooded. They had treated my son like a financial asset to be liquidated, and they had calculated his death with the same precision they used for an office building renovation. As I drove away from the villa, I looked at the digital copies of the evidence on my phone and realized that the time for running was officially over. I was no longer just a mother trying to hide from a threat, because I had now become the architect of their impending destruction. I knew that the gala event scheduled for 7 o'clock tonight would be the perfect stage to bring their empire of lies crashing down in front of the entire city. When the clock struck 7 in the evening, I stood before the brightly lit gala hall where Roxanne was preparing to receive the award for Distinguished Real Estate Entrepreneur. I decided against calling the police immediately because I knew that Clifford's deep connections within the legal system might allow him to suppress a private arrest before the public could ever see the truth. Instead, I activated a high-definition live stream across multiple social media platforms while watching the viewer count climb past 50,000 within the first few minutes as my followers shared the link with frantic urgency. The blue light from my smartphone screen cast a cold glow over my face while I began narrating the horrifying details of my sister's betrayal to a digital army that was growing larger with every passing second. I understood that this was the only way to ensure the evidence would remain permanent and completely untouchable by the corruption that had plagued our family for years. I walked with a steady and purposeful stride toward the main stage, just as Roxanne began her rehearsed speech about the importance of family values and community development in Portland. The heavy velvet curtains and shimmering chandeliers provided a grotesque backdrop for the dark secrets I was about to expose in front of the city's most influential business figures. I ignored the startled looks from the security guards and reached for the second microphone while turning my camera to capture Roxanne's sudden expression of pure and unadulterated shock. I looked directly into the lens to address my 60,000 viewers, while my voice echoed throughout the silent auditorium with the force of a final judgment. You are looking at a cold-blooded murderer who is currently trying to play the role of a saint in front of this city. The collective gasp from the crowd was loud enough to temporarily drown out the ambient hum of the air conditioning system in the grand hall. Roxanne turned impossibly pale beneath her expensive makeup while she attempted to maintain a frozen and artificial smile for the benefit of the bewildered guests in the front row. She leaned toward me until I could smell the expensive perfume on her skin, while she whispered with a desperate and trembling intensity that betrayed her growing panic. "Monica, have you completely lost your mind in front of these people, so please just come down, and we will discuss this matter privately, as sisters should." I did not offer her a single word of comfort because our sisterly bond had been severed the moment she put a price on my son's life for her own financial gain. I ignored her plea and adjusted the camera angle to ensure the millions of pixels captured every tremor in her hands as her carefully constructed world began to crumble in real time. I signaled Sonia through our encrypted link and ordered her to broadcast the digital evidence directly onto the massive projector screen that loomed behind the podium. The images of the nautical plan and the detailed notes regarding Adrian's planned drowning began to flicker across the wall because the entire gala hall fell into a heavy and suffocating silence. Sterling's voice suddenly filled the room with a haunting clarity as the hidden recording captured Clifford discussing my son's death as if it were a routine business transaction. The guests watched in horror as the transcriptions of the bribery list appeared on the screen and implicated the very officials who were currently sitting at the VIP tables with glasses of champagne. Each recorded word from Clifford felt like a hammer blow against the foundation of their criminal empire, while the audience watched the betrayal unfold in high definition. Clifford suddenly broke his paralysis and lunged toward me with a snarl of rage while reaching his hand out to snatch the smartphone from my grasp. I anticipated his aggressive move and retreated several steps while keeping the camera focused on his contorted face, which was now completely stripped of its professional mask. I raised my voice to ensure that the microphone captured my response for the audience that had now grown to 70,000 people across the globe. "You should think very carefully about your next move, Clifford, because there are 70,000 witnesses recording your every action, and they have already called the police to this location." His hand stopped mid-air while the realization that he was no longer in control of the narrative began to sink in with a crushing finality that made his shoulders slump. The atmosphere in the room transformed into one of absolute chaos as the guests began pulling out their own phones to record the scene, while several influential donors started shouting for the security to stand down. I stood firmly in the center of the stage and continued to narrate the evidence for the live stream, while the sound of sirens began to echo from the streets below the Grand Hotel. This was the moment that justice finally stepped out of the shadows, since the digital evidence was being preserved by thousands of individuals who were watching from their homes across the country. I felt a profound sense of relief while realizing that Roxanne and Clifford were trapped by the very technology they had attempted to use against my son's inheritance. The sirens of the Portland Police Department echoed outside the building just 10 minutes after the devastating truth was revealed to millions of online viewers. The rhythmic flashing of blue and red lights against the polished marble ballroom floor announced the final arrival of justice, while Roxanne and Clifford were forced to lower their heads in absolute disgrace. Several officers moved swiftly onto the stage to secure the perimeter, because the atmosphere in the grand hall was thick with the shock and outrage of the city's elite. I watched in silence as the gleaming metal handcuffs were clicked around my sister's wrists, while her expensive silk dress suddenly seemed like a tattered costume of her former lies. Clifford's face shifted from a mask of arrogant triumph to one of pathetic desperation as he was led toward the exit in front of thousands of recording smartphones. The public shredding of their carefully constructed reputations was finally complete, since the light of the truth had proven too bright for their shadows to survive. I stood tall and unwavering beside Adrian, who was clutching my hand with a quiet strength that suggested he understood the magnitude of our victory. Roxanne attempted to lunge toward us while weeping and shouting through her tears about the importance of our shared bloodline and our childhood memories. She begged for a mercy she had never planned to show my son because her voice was filled with a hollow desperation that only a cornered predator could produce. Monica, please tell them this is all just a terrible misunderstanding because we are the only family we have left in this world. Her words felt like poison in the air while I maintained a cold and distant expression to show her that the sister I once knew had long since vanished beneath her greed. I did not offer a single word of reconciliation, since the moment she plotted to steal my child's life was the moment she permanently forfeited her place in my heart. The subsequent legal proceedings were swift and unrelenting because the digital evidence we provided was so overwhelming that a plea deal was never an option for the prosecution. Roxanne and her husband eventually faced a jury that found them guilty on all counts, including conspiracy to commit first-degree murder and interstate financial fraud. They were sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole, which ensured that they would never again have the opportunity to prey upon the innocent for their personal gain. The corrupt officials on Clifford's list were also systematically identified and removed from their positions as a result of the federal investigation that followed our livestream. My father's trust fund was legally transferred into an independent management system that would be supervised by a reputable firm until Adrian reaches adulthood. This new structure ensures that his inheritance is protected by multiple layers of institutional security so that no individual family member can ever manipulate the funds again. Before we conclude today's gripping story, it is important to take a moment to reflect on the deeper implications of this terrifying family betrayal. Do not click away just yet, because the lessons hidden within this narrative could very well be the key to protecting those you love most in the future. At how greed can completely distort the morality of even our closest relatives. It is a harsh reality that some people will prioritize material wealth over the lives of their own flesh and blood when they are faced with financial ruin. Monica's story is a testament to the fact that we should never ignore the red flags of sudden, overwhelming generosity or secretive behavior from family members. Looking at the actions of Roxanne and Clifford, we see a calculated professional level of deception that relied entirely on the victim's silence and trust. I personally believe that Monica's decision to utilize a live stream was a brilliant strategic move that leveraged the power of digital accountability to bypass a potentially corrupt local system. If she had simply called the police, Clifford might have used his connections to bury the evidence before the world could see the truth. This brings us to a vital question for all of you watching, because I am curious about how you would have handled such a betrayal. If you found yourself in Monica's shoes, would you have the courage to confront your own sibling on a public stage, or would you have chosen a different path to find justice? Please share your thoughts and personal opinions in the comments below because your perspective adds incredible value to our community's understanding of these complex family dynamics. I truly appreciate everyone who has listened to this story until the very end, and I want to, as we continue to shine a light on the shadows where predators hide and work together to ensure that justice is always served. Your comments and shares help us reach